We know that prison harms people. I look at this place as a place of healing, not just for social wounds, but of the wounds inflicted on them by the state during their years in 8 square meters of high security.
When it comes to the death penalty, there's one question that continues to divide the public and the nation, and probably always will. What's more just, letting someone spend the rest of their life in a prison cell or executing them for the crime that they committed? It's one of the most polarizing debates currently in our justice system. On one side, there's the argument for finality, that the death penalty is the ultimate form of accountability. But on the other, there's this belief that even the worst among us might still be capable of change, and that life in prison is a harsher, more humane punishment. No appeals, no final meals, just the slow march of time. But here's where it gets complicated. What if the person has indeed changed? What if, like in the case of Kelly Gissendanner, a woman who was executed in Georgia back in 2015, who every person who encountered her truly believed that she was transformed, remorseful, and was making a positive impact behind bars? Does that change how we view justice? These are the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers. So ask yourself this. If you were convicted of a serious crime, would you rather live out your final years locked away in a cell, slowly aging and dying behind bars, or face the certainty of your death, knowing the exact day and time that your life would end? Well, today's case might force you to choose. We're looking at the story of Brandon Astor Jones, the oldest person ever executed by the state of Georgia, at least as of the time of this recording. He spent over 30 years on death row before being executed just 2 weeks shy of his 73rd birthday. Some say the state should have let him live out the rest of his life. Others believe his fate was long overdue. But no matter where you fall in this debate, one thing is certain: the gavel has fallen. I'm Nichole Mondshein, and this is Final Judgment, a deep dive into the final days, last choices, and chilling moments before execution on Georgia's death row. Some convictions unravel while some sentences are overturned. The evidence has been laid bare, the jury has spoken. But was justice truly served? For some, there's no appeal, no second chances, just the final judgment. But for others, the final judgment isn't so final after all. Brandon Astor Jones was born on February 13, 1943, Valentine's Day Eve, in Indiana. But his arrival into the world was anything but warm and loving. His mother was only 20 years old when she gave birth to Brandon, and she was already struggling with alcoholism. And his father was a married man who had a brief affair with his mother, so his father refused to take part in any of Brandon's life. And Brandon's early years were marked by deep instability. He was raised in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago with his brother, 3 women, and 4 other children. His mother worked long, grueling hours in the stockyards and at a tool and die factory, where she actually lost a finger to the machinery. And she was rarely home, and Brandon was often shuffled between households. By the time he was 5, Brandon landed in the care of his great aunt and her husband, who renamed Brandon Jimmy. But this new home was far from a safe haven. Brandon, or Jimmy, was often let alone, physically abused by his great uncle, and repeatedly molested by his cousin at just 5 years old. He constantly had bruises all over his body, frequently suffered from nosebleeds, and endured this cycle of trauma throughout much of his childhood. Then, at the age of 12, Brandon was sent back to live with his biological mother, but nothing had changed. His mother's alcoholism still cast a heavy shadow over their home. Her violent outbursts and multiple suicide attempts added to the chaos. So eventually, Brandon spiraled also into trouble. Then, at 13, Brandon robbed a milkman and was sent to the State Industrial School for Boys, a juvenile detention facility right outside the city where boys underwent military and religious training. Then, when he was 15, he was sent to the Sheridan Correctional Center, a state reformatory known for its horrific treatment for boys. In 1961, actually, the superintendent and 6 staffers from that facility were fired because reports surfaced that alleged that boys there were constantly beaten, confined naked in dark, cramped cells, and had to survive unlimited food rations. An investigation into the facility also found that many boys under the age of 15 were also preyed upon sexually by the older boys, including men that were in their 20s. Like so much of his early life, it was not a place of rehabilitation, but rather of further neglect. Much about his life between then and his arrest remains unclear, including how and why he eventually left Chicago for Georgia. But what is clear is that Brandon's early years were defined by abandonment, violence, and trauma, conditions that shaped the man he would become. And yet, behind bars on Georgia's death row, Brandon began to change. Over the decades, he found solace in writing. He became a published author, completing essays, articles, and 2 full manuscripts, one a historical fiction novel, the other a memoir. Through words, Brandon reached far beyond prison walls. On his personal WordPress blog, which still exists today, which you can find online, Brandon described himself as an Aquarius from Chicago with a love for archery, sailing, and crafting wooden boats. He had a playful charm, loved women, and listed How Stella Got Her Groove Back and All Quiet on the Western Front as his 2 favorite films. His musical tastes leaned toward Afro-Cuban jazz, and he admired books like To Kill a Mockingbird, The Little Prince, and Roots. In one essay, he shared that he joined the U.S. Army in 1962 at the age of 19. And it's there he met his wife, Ruby, though the marriage was very short-lived. On his enlistment form, he falsely claimed to have completed 9 years of schooling, when in reality, he hadn't even finished elementary school. Just before his discharge, Brandon was evaluated by a military mental health professional and was diagnosed with severe depression, PTSD, and bipolar disorder. His clinical psychologist said that Brandon showed many signs of physical, sexual, and emotional trauma. His superiors deemed him unfit for continued service. So once again, Brandon found himself cast aside, but this time by the military that he hoped would offer him a brand new start. It wasn't until he was in prison that he actually earned his GED. He wrote candidly about how, for much of his life, he could barely write a letter, let alone a book. But prison gave him that time and purpose. At the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Jackson, Brandon began with poetry, essays, and writing personal reflections. He described how reading and writing became almost addictive to him. He devoured anything he could find or put his hands on, from books, magazines, even old newspapers. And then soon, he started seeking publication. He was actually eventually offered a 250-word weekly column in the Atlanta News Weekly titled An Inside Look with Brandon Astor Jones. That column ran for nearly a year, until it was canceled. Why? Well, it's because Brandon wrote a piece criticizing then Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas, who he researched thoroughly in the prison law library. While most of Brandon's previous articles had gone without much response, that single column generated 10 letters, basically hate mail, all from outraged African-American readers who couldn't believe that the author, Brandon, would speak so critically about a black man from Georgia. And as you can tell, the backlash was swift and the paper dropped his column. But it's worth noting the irony, because in the years that followed, Clarence Thomas would go on to face widespread controversy and criticism, particularly surrounding sexual harassment allegations. But at the time, Brandon's commentary was seen as unacceptable, and his voice was silenced once again. But undeterred, Brandon turned abroad. He built a relationship with Alan Myers, who was an American living in Australia who had founded the Green Left weekly newspaper. And it's there Brandon was given a now 550-word column called Looking Out. This column ran for over 11 years, nearly every week of the year, and reached readers from all across Australia. Through his column Looking Out, Brandon tackled everything from race and class to sexism, prison life, capital punishment, music, history, and even global politics. But once again, when a new editor took over, one who reportedly thought Brandon's writings were too pro-America, his column was dropped. But still, his words have traveled. His ideas reached readers halfway around the world from the prison cell where he spent over 30 years. But how did Brandon Astor Jones even end up there in the first place? That takes us back to Georgia in the late 1970s. Though information about his life right before the crime is sparse, it was a fatal armed robbery at a Cobb County convenience store that ultimately changed the course of his life and eventually led to his execution, just weeks shy of his 73rd birthday. On the night of June 16, 1979, 29-year-old Roger Tackett, manager of a Tenneco convenience store in Cobb County, Georgia, stayed late after closing to finish up some paperwork. He was working overtime and he was hoping to free up some time to spend Father's Day weekend with his 7-year-old daughter and wife. But just before 2 a.m., something seemed off. A Cobb County police officer who was just passing through the area actually stopped at that particular gas station to let a stranded motorist use the payphone. That officer then noticed Roger's car parked out front with the driver's door wide open and the lights still on inside the store, well past closing time. Suspicious, the officer approached and looked through the front window. And that's when he saw a man, later identified as Brandon, peek out from the storeroom at the back of the store and then quietly disappear. The officer quietly entered the store, and seconds later he heard 3 gunshots, then a pause, and then a 4th. He drew out his weapon and called out, but got no response. He cautiously opened the storeroom door, and that's when he found Brandon Jones and another man, Van Roosevelt Solomon, standing just inside. The officer detained both men, handcuffing Brandon and placing Solomon in his patrol car, and then called for backup. A private security officer nearby responded first, and while waiting for reinforcements, he questioned the 2 men. Brandon admitted that they had come to indeed burglarize the store, and he also claimed that when they arrived that they found Roger already badly hurt in the back room. But the truth became clearer once officers forced open the storeroom door, which was locked behind the suspects. There, lying face down, was the body of the manager, Roger Tackett. He had been shot 5 times, once in the jaw, once behind the left ear, once in the thumb, and twice in the hip. The fatal shot was determined to be the one behind his ear, likely fired while Roger was already on the ground wounded. 2 .38 caliber revolvers were found near the suspects. One had 2 shell casings inside and the other had 4. Tests later confirmed that both Brandon and Solomon had either fired a gun or handled one just recently. The store's cash drawer had been removed, wrapped in a plastic bag, and placed near the front door. Inside their van, police discovered burglary tools, caliber bullets, and holsters matching the weapons that were used in the crime. And what made the tragedy even more haunting was Roger's backstory. Before working at the gas station, he had been a teacher, fluent in Russian, French, and Latin, and had taught at Georgia Southern College. When funding cuts forced him out of education, that's when he turned to retail work, where he was earning more than when he was actually a teacher. That night he stayed late, but unfortunately would never make it home. Brandon Astor Jones was sentenced to death on October 17, 1979, for his part in this deadly armed robbery. His accomplice, Van Roosevelt Solomon, was executed back in 1985 by electrocution at the age of 41. To understand the full weight of Brandon's sentence, you have to first understand the moment in history in which it happened. Brandon was arrested and sentenced to death at a time when the entire legal system in Georgia and across the United States was being forced to reckon with the racism backed into capital punishment. Just a few years before his trial, the Supreme Court temporarily struck down the death penalty nationwide in a landmark case called Furman versus Georgia, pointing to how inconsistently and unfairly it was being used, especially against Black defendants like Brandon.
Furman versus Georgia is a landmark case because it was the first and only time in American history that the Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional, which meant that in all of the places that it was then practiced, which was 40 states and the federal government, it disappeared overnight. There's a story there because, as we all know, the death penalty is still quite alive and well here in the United States. So Furman was not the end of that story, but it was certainly a major landmark along the way. It has been a long tradition in the United States that juries tend to be the ones imposing the death penalty. And prior to Furman versus Georgia, juries were given complete discretion as to whether someone should get the death penalty for a crime versus some lesser punishment.
In the event that you find the accused guilty, the death sentence is mandatory in this case.
The death penalty was in decline already in the 1960s in the United States, as it was in Europe, but the LDF's litigation campaign brought it to a complete halt. So from 1967 to 1972, in the 5 years prior to the decision in Furman versus Georgia, there were no executions in the United States. The LDF was raising every possible constitutional issue they could think of, and I'm not going to list them all. There were a lot. And the Supreme Court started granting cert on them. And it looked, and this is the exciting part of the story, it looked in 1971 like the LDF lost because the Supreme Court granted cert and decided a case called McGautha versus California, which decided exactly the same kind of challenge that was litigated in Furman, but under the Due Process Clause. So that was the same claim that the lawyers had brought in Furman under the Eighth Amendment. But since the court had just rejected that claim under the Due Process Clause, most people thought that Furman didn't have a chance. Of course, they turned out to be wrong about that. Two of the justices who had been in the majority in McGautha rejecting that claim changed their minds, and the following year voted in favor of that same claim about lack of standards guiding capital sentencing juries in Furman itself. Stewart and White, along with Justices William Brennan, Thurgood Marshall, and William O. Douglas, made the 5 justices in the majority in Furman to declare the American death penalty unconstitutional in 1972.
In response, Georgia rewrote its death penalty laws, claiming to make the system more fair. But it still didn't take long for the cracks to show. Of the first 12 people executed under the new law, 9 were black. Brandon landed on death row only a few years after this so-called reform. And when he got there, he joined another black man, Warren McKenzie, who was fighting his own battle in the courts. Warren's case would go all the way to the Supreme Court, backed by hard data showing that black defendants, especially those accused of killing white victims, were far more likely to be sentenced to death in Georgia. But in 1987, the court rejected his appeal, saying racial bias wasn't unconstitutional unless it could be proven to be intentional. So, in other words, the system could be racist as long as it wasn't being deliberately racist. And that ruling effectively shut the door on future challenges to racial disparities in the death penalty. And it cemented the kind of system that had condemned Brandon. One where you are who you are and who the victim is can shape your sentence just as much as the facts of the case. But the racial disparities weren't the only problem with Georgia's death penalty statute. In 1980, just a year after Brandon was first sentenced, the Supreme Court decided another case out of Georgia. Now this one, Godfrey versus Georgia. And this time the court struck down a part of the law that allowed the death penalty for murders deemed outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman. The justices said those words were too vague, that it gave juries too much room for interpretation, too much power to impose death based on emotion and not law. The court warned that capital punishment should only be applied when a crime clearly fits within a narrow and objective definition. Anything less, they said, opened the door to arbitrary and inconsistent sentencing. And so it begs the question, would Brandon's case, tried in the wake of Furman versus Georgia and just before Godfrey versus Georgia, meet the standard for the death penalty today? Was his sentencing based on clear constitutional guidelines? Or was it shaped by the same vague, emotional, and racially charged frameworks the court would later warn against? But Brandon caught a rare break, at least for a while. Years after his original conviction, his case was reopened, not because of new evidence, but because of a serious error in the jury room. During deliberations, jurors brought in a Bible and used it to guide their decision-making. A federal court ruled that this was improper and violated his right to a fair trial. So because of that, Brandon was granted a brand new sentencing hearing in 1989. But even with that second chance, by 1997, he was once again sentenced to death. During that resentencing trial, something extraordinary happened. People who had followed Brandon's writing, some of them from as far away as the UK and Australia, stepped up to try to save his life. These weren't just pen pals. These were people who saw value in his transformation and believed that Brandon's voice mattered. One supporter, Michael Markham, wrote to the Georgia Indigent Defense Council explaining how Brandon's writing could actually reach young offenders and show them that there is another path, one that doesn't end in violence or prison. He wrote that Brandon's words helped people understand that change is possible and that redemption isn't just an abstract idea. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. In his closing argument, the prosecutor dismissed all of Brandon's writing, all of his support, by saying Brandon had never shown true remorse. He's got all kinds of pen pals who apparently would do anything for him, the prosecutor said, but not a single one of them reached out to the victim's family to ask for forgiveness on his behalf. So where's the remorse? Brandon's defense team called for a mistrial, arguing that the statement violated his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. But the court denied this motion. When the jury reached a standstill due to one juror's hesitation, the judge pushed them to keep going. And then a few hours later, they returned with the same exact result: death. Brandon would continue to fight his sentence through appeals. In 2000, his motion for a new trial was denied. The Georgia Supreme Court upheld his death sentence later that year, and then in 2001, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case. After Brandon was resentenced to death in 1997, his legal team didn't stop fighting for his life. Over the next several years, they filed multiple appeals in both Georgia state courts and in the federal courts, trying every possible legal route to overturn his sentence. Then in 2002, Brandon's lawyers filed what's called a habeas corpus petition in Georgia, a legal way to challenge whether someone is being held lawfully. They argued that there were serious problems with his trial that made the sentence entirely unfair. A hearing was held in 2004, but in 2006, the state court rejected his claims. 2 years later, the Georgia Supreme Court also denied his appeal. And after that, his attorneys turned to the federal courts in hopes of a different outcome. In 2009, they filed another habeas corpus petition, this time in a U.S. district court. But again, in 2011, that court denied him any relief. The case went up to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, where Brandon's team argued again in 2013, but in March 2014, the appeals court also ruled against him. After the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Brandon Jones' final appeal in 2015, the legal path ahead was effectively closed, but his attorneys still fought until the very end. In January 2016, just 1 month before his scheduled execution, they filed an emergency motion, asking a Georgia court to halt his execution altogether. They challenged Georgia's secrecy law around lethal injection drugs and argued that Brandon's death sentence no longer fit the crime. His legal team acknowledged his role in the robbery, but emphasized that Brandon was not in fact the shooter, he was just the lookout. They argued that his co-defendant, who was executed decades earlier, was actually the trigger man. His attorneys also pointed out that Brandon had already served more time than most people in Georgia who were actually sentenced to life for very similar crimes. They argued that if the same crime happened today, it would likely result in a life sentence, not death. In their clemency petition, they wrote this: Brandon Jones' sentence is a lone outlier in Georgia, an artifact of another era. They cited data showing that since the 1990s, Georgia had stopped handing out death sentences in armed robbery cases just like his, even when those crimes resulted in a death. His case in particular stood out as one of the few remaining from a harsher time, thus a harsher sentence. By this point, Brandon was 72 years old and reportedly struggling with dementia and physical health decline. His attorneys argued that he had changed profoundly behind bars, becoming a writer, a mentor, and a man who inspired others, even from within the prison's walls. Brandon was now a grandfather to 18 grandchildren and 22 great-grandchildren. Several of them even wrote heartfelt letters to the parole board, describing how he remained a consistent and positive role model in their lives, despite being behind bars. Brandon himself pleaded with the board, saying that if given mercy, he would devote the rest of his life to his writing and family. But both the court and the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles rejected these pleas. On February 2nd, 2016, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit narrowly voted 6-5 not to reconsider Brandon's challenge to the state's drug secrecy law. His team had argued that Georgians have a right to know where the drugs used in executions come from, especially given the history of problematic lethal injections that were occurring nationwide. But the court ruled that Brandon had waited way too long to raise this concern. Cobb County District Attorney Vic Reynolds pushed back on the idea that Brandon was too old or mentally unfit to be executed. He said he read Brandon's writings and saw no sign of cognitive decline. Despite decades of appeals, shifting public opinion, and deeply personal pleas from his family, Brandon Jones' fate was sealed. His execution, over 36 years after the crime, almost 4 decades on death row, raised lingering questions about justice, redemption, and whether people can truly change, even after a lifetime behind bars. Brandon Astor Jones was executed on February 3rd, 2016, just 10 days before his 73rd birthday. The lethal injection took place shortly before 1 a.m. at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. And then, in a surreal, haunting twist, the last person Brandon saw before he died was the same man who'd prosecuted him nearly 4 decades earlier, former Cobb County District Attorney Tom Sharon, sitting front row to witness it all come full circle. His execution was delayed for several hours as his legal team filed a last-minute appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. But in a moment thick with irony, it was Justice Clarence Thomas who denied that request. Yes, that Clarence Thomas, the same man Brandon had written about in a published column decades earlier, the one that got Brandon banned from writing for some time. That rejection added an extra layer of bitterness to an already tragic ending. At the heart of this final appeal was a challenge to Georgia's execution secrecy law. The law essentially keeps everything surrounding the lethal injection process a tightly guarded secret, including the identity of the drug manufacturer. It's framed as a way to protect small compounding pharmacies from public backlash, but opponents argue that this lack of transparency makes it impossible to know whether the drugs are in fact safe or whether they could cause someone an unnecessarily painful death. Brandon's lawyers argued that the execution drugs posed a very serious risk of harm, potentially violating the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But they couldn't fully prove it because the secrecy law blocks access to the very information that they needed to be successful. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals was split on the issue. While a majority rejected the appeal, 5 of the judges openly criticized the secrecy law, calling into question the fairness and ethics of hiding such critical information from public scrutiny. But in the end, none of it mattered or was enough. Brandon Jones' decades-long fight ended not with a reversal, not with clemency, but with silence from the very institutions he had spent his life challenging. In the days leading up to his execution, Brandon was visited by 3 close friends and 11 family members. His lawyer and an investigator also spent some time with him. And despite being offered a special last meal, Brandon declined. Instead, he ate the standard prison fare: chicken and rice, rutabaga, seasoned turnip greens, dried white beans, cornbread, and a dessert of bread pudding with fruit punch, according to the Georgia Department of Corrections. On the night of his execution, however, the process didn't go quite smoothly. The execution team struggled for 45 minutes to find a usable vein. They first spent 24 minutes attempting to insert the IV into Brandon's left arm, followed by another 8 minutes on his right. Eventually, they called in a prison doctor to place the IV in his groin, a process that took an additional 13 minutes. At 12:30 a.m. in the morning, the warden exited the chamber, a signal that the lethal drug would soon begin to flow, typically within a minute or two. Though the injection itself isn't visible to witnesses, what followed was. At first, Brandon laid still with his eyes closed. He swallowed a few times, moved his head slightly, and then at 12:36 a.m. opened his eyes and turned his head to the left, appearing to glance at a clock on the wall. He closed his eyes once again, took a few deep breaths, and eventually fell motionless. He was pronounced dead at 12:46 a.m. Brandon Astor Jones was 72 years old, the oldest person ever executed in the state of Georgia, and the 5th oldest in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated. In his final moments, he offered a prayer and recorded a last statement. His final words weren't about himself. They were directed toward the family of his victim, Roger Tackig. In his final written statement, he wrote, "To the family of the victim, I regret the pain I caused you. I pray for your healing. I'm sorry for what I did." Outside the prison, as Brandon's life came to an end, a small group of about 15 supporters and anti-death penalty advocates gathered quietly about a mile away. They stood in a circle, held hands, and prayed. One of those present was Carol Butcher, a woman from the UK who had been corresponding with Brandon for around 15 years. She told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that their friendship had helped her through difficult times. "We had our ups and downs," she said, "but he supported me through mine." The execution also drew a peaceful protest near the prison entrance, led by attorney Daniel Colber. Protesters held signs with messages like "Two wrongs don't make a right," and "Yes, Georgia, there is an alternative to the death penalty," urging the state to reconsider capital punishment. Over his 36 years on death row, Brandon would forge many relationships with readers, and many became pen pals with him. He would often see his readers more than he did his own family. A woman who became close friends with Brandon through the UK-based charity Lifelines, an organization that connects pen pals with people on America's death row, was with him during his final days. Their friendship spanned over 15 years, and in the days leading up to his execution, she actually flew to Georgia to say her goodbye. She later wrote about her visit in a piece for Inside Time, a publication for incarcerated individuals in the UK. In it, she recalled what it was like to see Brandon just 3 days before he died. 3 days earlier, I had visited Brandon at the prison. Having been checked by security, I walked alone through a long corridor and up some stairs to the visiting rooms. Nobody was around and everywhere was silent. Far away, I could see 3 figures approaching slowly. 2 tall guards in black, either side of a much smaller figure dressed in white. It was Brandon. As a sad little party came closer to me, I could see the chain around Brandon's waist. Closer still, and I could see fine silver chains connecting his handcuffs to his waist chain. He looked at me, smiled, and then tried to put his hands together as if in prayer. We had 15 precious minutes together, talking about anything and everything before his family arrived. She described meeting Brandon's children, his daughters Veronica and Lisa, and his son David, as well as several grandchildren and other relatives as well. One by one, they all took turns speaking to Brandon through the prison's telephone system. She said Brandon was grinning ear to ear, savoring every second of seeing his family one last time. When the day of his execution finally arrived, Tuesday, February 2nd, she returned for what would be their final visit together. Tuesday, February 2nd came, the day set for Brandon's death sentence to be carried out. The visit that day was an hour shorter and lasted from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. All his family were there, as well as his lawyer and investigator. We still had hope that the Supreme Court of the United States would rule in Brandon's favor. The last 20 minutes of that final visit were poignant and moving. One of his daughters read from the Bible, and everyone held hands. I was in tears, and Brandon reached across and wiped my eyes with a tissue. The last time I saw Brandon alive, he was standing at the door of the visiting room, holding on the grill and trying to be brave. His children have every reason to be proud of how he conducted himself during those final hours. My heart was heavy. We were ordered to leave the area, so there was no last look at my friend as he was led away. Back at the prison, Brandon's loved ones waited in agony for word from the Supreme Court. But the ruling they prayed for never came. His final appeal was denied. Witnesses said it took officials more than an hour to find a vein to deliver the lethal cocktail of drugs, finally finding one in his groin. Once they found it, Brandon's eyes closed and the warden left the room. 6 minutes later, Brandon opened his eyes again and appeared to look at the clock and then at his lawyer and then he closed his eyes and was still. As she left the prison grounds that morning, the woman described the somber moment when a black vehicle labeled Butts County Coroner passed their car. Inside was Brandon's body. We followed it for a short while before it turned onto the freeway. None of us spoke on the journey home. Rest in peace, my friend. I am so glad you touched my life in a friendship that lasted for more than 15 years. I miss you. But even after his death, Brandon Astor Jones' voice hasn't gone silent. His writings, many of which are still available online, continue to resonate with people all around the world. Over the years, Brandon became more than just an inmate. He evolved into a powerful thinker and advocate for prison reform, using his lived experience to challenge how incarceration is handled in the US and beyond. In one of his most striking essays, Brandon reflected on the stark contrast between the American prison system and more rehabilitative models like those in Norway. His words were clear, compassionate, and deeply challenging. As a prison governor or politician, we have to approach this incarceration in a different way. We have to respect people's needs for revenge, but not use that as a foundation for how we run our prisons. Many people here have done something stupid. They will not do again. But prisons are also full of people who have all sorts of problems. Should I be in charge of adding more problems to the prisoner on behalf of the state, making him or her an even worse threat to larger society because I have treated her or him badly while they were in my care? We know that prison harms people. I look at this place as a place of healing, not just for social wounds, but of the wounds inflicted on them by the state during their years in 8 square meters of high security. In those few sentences, Brandon distilled what many prison reformers have been trying to say for decades: that punishment alone doesn't create justice, and cruelty doesn't create safety. For him, prison wasn't just a place of punishment, it was a mirror held up to society itself. And he believed that how we treat the incarcerated says everything about who we are. Then, in 2013, Brandon wrote a powerful column addressed to the Georgia Prison Commissioner. In it, he described the degrading conditions that he faced, like being forced to eat while shackled and being denied even a free hand to clean himself after using the bathroom. He called out these policies as one that rob medical prisoners of our human dignity. Through his writing, published and shared across the US, the UK, and even Australia, Brandon Astor Jones created a small but powerful network of people who truly saw him. People who may have never met Brandon in real life, but people who still advocated for him. Many became longtime pen pals, reaching out to him while he was incarcerated at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison. One of those people was Michael Markham, who had been working as a jail commander in San Francisco when he first contacted Brandon back in 1993. He's also the same man who wrote to the Georgia Indigent Defense Council during Brandon's sentencing trial back in 1997.
If you want to know what life is really like inside an American prison, you have a choice. You can talk to a jailer and get the story from his perspective, or you can talk to an inmate and get the story from his. Or, as we reported last year, you can talk to Michael Markham, who may know more about prisons than anyone else in this country. That's because he's been on both sides of the bars.
His title is Assistant Sheriff for San Francisco County, number 3 man in the department, in charge of 5 jails, including this one, San Bruno, the oldest in the state of California. He is responsible for more than 2,000 inmates who've been charged with everything from misdemeanor drug possession to rape, robbery, and murder. And he commands a force of 600 sheriff's deputies, even though by law, as a convicted felon, he is prevented from taking the oath of a sworn law enforcement officer.
How much time did you spend in prison?
A little over 6 years.
Places like this?
Exactly like this.
He was a 19-year-old part-time college student when he was sent off to the Vacaville State Prison in California in 1966, inmate B5427. Strange as it may seem, the man who runs San Francisco's jails is not only a convicted felon, but a convicted murderer.
Michael had read something Brandon wrote and wanted permission to reprint it in his jail's newsletter. The facility he worked at was quite unique. There, inmates raised plants in greenhouses and cared for buffalo as part of a vocational rehab program that Michael actually had helped create. Michole believed prisons should be places of growth, not just punishment, and he felt Brandon's insights on prison reform and justice aligned with that mission. That one letter turned into a years-long friendship. The men discovered unexpected connections between the two, like the fact that Brandon's favorite pizza spot growing up actually belonged to Michael's father-in-law. Michole published Brandon's work regularly in the jail newsletter, and it resonated deeply with both inmates and staff. According to Michole, many incarcerated men even began to view Brandon as a role model for them. But as Brandon's health declined, the letters stopped. But still, when Michole heard the execution had been scheduled, he didn't hesitate. He wrote 2 letters, one to his old friend and another to the Georgia Board of Pardons and Parole, pleading for mercy. But as we know, the board didn't grant clemency. But what stayed with Michole, and many others, was how deeply Brandon's words had mattered to people around the world. How his voice reached across prison walls, beyond state lines, and into the hearts of people who never even met him. And maybe the most surprising of all those who reconnected with Brandon were his very own children. He always had a closer relationship with his grandkids and great-grandkids. But with his own 4 children, now in their 50s, it was a completely different story. For most of their lives, he was just a shadow, in and out of the prison. David, one of his sons, said he hadn't spoken to his father in decades, admitting that it felt like his father was actually dead. That's how big his absence felt. But just before the execution, all 4 of Brandon's children came to see him one last time in Georgia. For the first time in their lives, they saw their father together. They sat in a room with him, face to face. It was their first contact visit and the first time David ever touched his father's hand. He said Brandon had looked like he had given up, ready to refuse clemency just to avoid the state dissatisfaction of hearing him beg for his life again. But seeing his kids changed something within him. I think he realized he had a reason to live. For us, David said. Brandon stood up and walked the length of the visiting room with each of them, one by one. They all cried. They all hugged. My children are talking to him for the first time in their lives, David said. If Georgia executes him, they're going to lose the grandfather they just met. David returned to Georgia days later, hoping for a second chance, not just for his father, but for the family finally beginning to heal, because this is what redemption can look like. Brandon Jones committed a crime. There's no taking that back. But in the years that followed, he changed. He wrote, he reached people, he rebuilt bridges with a family that once considered him a ghost. He grew, and the question still lingers, was killing him truly justice, or did the state silence a voice that had only just begun to matter? Brandon Astor Jones was executed just days before his 73rd birthday, a life cut short not by time, but by the state. And it leaves us asking, had he been allowed to live out his final years, how many more lives could he have changed with his words, his growth, and his hard-earned wisdom? After more than 35 years on death row, Brandon Astor Jones became the very image of what Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer once called the unconscionably long delay between sentencing and execution, a delay that disproportionately affects the elderly, the mentally ill, and those tried under outdated standards of justice. Brandon wasn't just a prisoner. He was an example of a darker chapter in Georgia's death penalty history, one marked by racial bias, prosecutorial overreach, and a system many now agree would not sentence someone like him to death today. Yes, the crime he committed was horrific. A man, Roger Taddock, lost his life. That pain is real, we're not denying it. And it deserves acknowledgement. His wife didn't deserve to lose her husband, and their child didn't deserve to lose their father. But Brandon was sentenced to die under a standard of justice that no longer exists. In today's legal climate, it's likely he would have faced life without parole, not death. Stephen Bright, who at the time of Brandon's execution was the president of the Southern Center for Human Rights, once called these outdated cases zombie cases, cases that refuse to die and serve only as grim reminders of how unfair the justice system used to be. And like Kelly Gissendaner before him, Brandon wasn't just another name on a death row roster. He found purpose behind bars, not in physical acts, but through art, advocacy, and the written word. His essays and reflections traveled farther than he ever could, touching lives across the globe. He became a voice for prison reform, for dignity, and for humanity. People are complicated. We all make mistakes, some unforgivable, but we have to ask, when someone spends decades growing, evolving, and influencing others for good, does that count for nothing? Should the worst thing someone ever did define their entire life? This isn't about minimizing the loss of Roger Taggart. His life mattered. His family's grief is very much real. But we're left to wonder, did executing a 72-year-old man in declining health serve justice, or did it deny the possibility of redemption? Because Brandon Jones wasn't just the oldest person ever executed in the state of Georgia, he was also a man whose life, by the end, stood for something greater than the crime that began it. One thing is certain, while the final judgment has been made in Brandon Astor Jones' case, his story is far from over.